The girl cried every night after the maid went to sleep. One day the maid pretended to be asleep. When she heard what the girl's father did at night, she was terrified. The shiny black car stopped smoothly in front of the large door of the Moore mansion. Charles Moore, always impeccable in his business suit, got out first, walking around the vehicle to open the door for his daughter Susan, who carried the weight of another long day in her eyes. "Come on, Susan, we don't have all the time in the world. Tomorrow we have another rehearsal and you need to be at your best as a model," Charles said, with a tone that mixed urgency and a distorted sense of paternal concern. Susan, dragging her feet, barely had time to respond before being greeted by Helen at the mansion's entrance. The maid opened her arms, enveloping the girl in a hug that seemed to say everything words couldn't. "Oh, my dear, you look so tired today. Come, I'll prepare something special for you to eat, something to make you feel better, yes?" Helen's voice was a refuge, filled with a warmth and affection that Susan rarely found elsewhere. Charles watched the interaction from a distance, his sharp eyes capturing every detail. "Helen, remember that Susan is on a strict diet. No deviations today. She needs to maintain her shape for the judges. It's for her own good," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Charles's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Susan, still in Helen's arms, whispered, her voice almost lost among the echoes of the grand entrance. "I just wish things were different, Helen. I wish I could choose, choose my life, my dreams, choose to be with Mom." Susan's words were filled with a deep longing for a different life, far from the expectations and pressures imposed by her father. Helen, guiding Susan to the kitchen, whispered back, her words tinged with gentle yet firm wisdom. "I know, my dear, I know. But remember, the darkest night is just before dawn. You have a strong spirit, Susan, a spirit that no stage or judge can truly imprison. We're in this together. You're not alone." Helen's words not only offered comfort but wove a silent promise, a vow of loyalty and protection. Meanwhile, Charles Moore remained still, watching the interaction between his daughter and the maid. His thoughts were a labyrinth of expectations and pressures, a reflection of his own unrealized dreams, and his determination to see Susan succeed in the modeling career he so wanted for her. "She'll thank me one day when she's on top, when she's somebody. All this will be just a distant memory, a small price to pay for greatness," Charles thought, convincing himself that the path he had chosen for Susan was the only possible one. The kitchen became a refuge, a small world apart where Helen and Susan could talk and dream away from Charles's judging eyes. "Now, let's find something you can eat. Something that won't make your father frown at us but will still bring a smile to your face," Helen said, as she rummaged through the cupboards for something that met these specific criteria. "You know, Helen, sometimes when I'm out there on stage parading under all those lights, I feel like I'm more distant from myself than ever. It's as if every step, every smile is just part of something I never decided to pursue," Susan confessed, while helping Helen prepare a simple yet nutritious salad. Helen looked at Susan, her eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and firmness. "Susan, my dear, never forget who you are, no matter how many stages you walk or how many dazzling dresses you wear. Your essence, your true self, is much more than any title they might give you. And remember, I'll always be here to remind you of that, always." The conversation between the two was a stark contrast to the loneliness and silence that dominated the rest of the mansion. For a brief moment, the kitchen was filled with laughter and shared dreams, a haven of human warmth amidst the cold ambition of Charles. At the end of the night, as Susan climbed the stairs to her room, a feeling of gratitude warmed her heart. "Thank you, Helen, for everything," she murmured, almost silently, but with enough certainty for the words to reach the maid who was cleaning the kitchen. "Good night, Susan. Dream with the angels," Helen replied with a smile that carried the promise of better days. This simple exchange of words was routine, like a reminder of the unbreakable bond that united them, a silent strength that somehow promised to defy the storms to come. After the warm farewell with Helen, Susan climbed the stairs, each step echoing the loneliness she felt. Upon reaching her room, she closed the door slowly, leaning against it with a deep sigh. "Why is it so hard to accept the life of a model?" she thought, letting herself fall onto the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the world on her young shoulders. "I just want to be understood. I just want Dad to see that these contests and fashion shows are destroying me inside. They are not my happiness, they are my prison. In the silence of her room, surrounded by her trophies and sashes that were supposed to represent achievements, Susan felt more distant from herself than ever. Helen understands. She always understands, but she's the only one. If only Mom were here, things would be different. She would get me out of this prison. Susan's words were lost in the vast emptiness of the mansion. Meanwhile, in her modest room, Helen was preparing for bed, but her thoughts were with Susan. That girl has so much potential, so much brightness, that is stifled every day. Charles doesn't see or doesn't want to see. Susan needs freedom, space to be herself, not the version they want her to be. Even in the darkness of her room, Helen felt a growing determination, a silent promise to do more to help Susan find her way. The night wore on, and the mansion seemed to wrap itself in a shroud of silence. But in the quiet, the muffled sound of Susan's crying in her room seeped through the corridors, a sad melody breaking the silence. In her room, Helen tossed and turned, the distant sounds disturbing her sleep. "They're just dreams," she tried to convince herself. "Just sad dreams reflecting my own fears and worries about Susan. She's fine." But deep down, a part of her knew that those cries were real, echoes of a reality she wished she could change. At dawn, the soft light of the sun began to bathe the mansion's corridors, bringing with it a new day, but the echoes of the previous night remained. Helen was the first to rise, as always, her movements careful and quiet as she prepared breakfast. Susan, in turn, woke up with the first rays of the sun, the traces of tears still visible on her face. Getting up, she walked to the mirror, facing her reflection. "Today is a new day," she told herself, trying to put a strength into her words that she didn't feel. "I need to be strong. For myself, for Mom, and even for Helen, who believes in me more than I do." Susan descended the stairs, drawn by the inviting aroma coming from the kitchen. Her walk, still marked by the hesitation of the sleepless night, softened as she spotted Helen. "Good morning, Helen. It looks like you've already started working your magic here," said Susan, a slight smile appearing on her lips as she felt the welcoming atmosphere that the maid always managed to create. Helen turned to Susan, returning the smile with an even warmer one. "Good morning, dear. Today I thought of making something special for breakfast, something to remind us that Saturdays are for relaxing and recharging our energies. How about pancakes with honey and fresh fruit?" Helen's proposal was not just an offer of food, but a gesture of affection, an attempt to bring some lightness to Susan's often rigid routine. Susan sat at the kitchen table, watching Helen move skillfully. "You always know how to make the days better, Helen. I really appreciate it, you know." Susan's words carried a weight, a deep sincerity that went beyond the routine air of the moment. It was a confession of gratitude, an acknowledgement of the light that Helen brought into her life. As the two shared breakfast, the conversation flowed naturally, covering everything from the simplest weekend plans to the deepest dreams and desires. Helen listened attentively, always encouraging Susan to open up, to express those parts of herself that were so often repressed by her father's demands. The clock struck noon when Charles Moore joined them for lunch. The light atmosphere that surrounded Susan and Helen subtly changed, the air carrying an almost palpable tension with the presence of the family's patriarch. Helen, noticing the change, remained alert, ready to smooth things over if necessary. During the meal, the conversation revolved around trivialities until Susan, encouraged by the proximity and support of Helen, touched on a delicate subject. "Dad, I was thinking about Mom. Could we visit her soon? I really miss her," said Susan, her voice trembling but determined, seeking to open a space for the long-avoided dialogue. Charles Moore, grabbing a napkin with more force than necessary, responded with a tone that brooked no argument. "Susan, we've discussed this. It's not appropriate to bring your mother into this conversation. You have everything you need here. Focusing on her only distracts you from what's really important." His statement was final, cutting off any hope of a more open dialogue on the subject. Helen, standing by, felt her heart tighten at the sight of Susan's expression. The girl lowered her head, accepting the reprimand in silence. The maid wished to intervene, wished to defend Susan and remind Charles of the importance of maternal love, of the connection that should not be ignored or underestimated. However, she knew well the rules of the mansion and the place she occupied within it. After the tense silence that followed the mention of her mother, Charles Moore seized the opportunity to steer the conversation back to more familiar ground. Susan's obligations and expectations. With a look that swept the table like a general assessing his troops, he fixed his gaze on Susan with calculated intensity. As for your schedule today, we have a long list of preparatory tasks for the next fashion show. And remember, Susan, it's essential that we review your eating habits and personal care routine. You're eating too much again and your hair is visibly dry. We need to maintain an impeccable image at all times, he said, mixing concern with a sense of duty. Susan, feeling the weight of each word like stones in her pockets, lowered her gaze to her plate, now without appetite. In her mind, a storm of responses formed, each one clamoring to be said. However, the reality of her situation and the desire to avoid conflict with her father made her choose the path of submission. "Understood, Dad. I'll try harder," she murmured, her voice barely rising above a whisper, a demonstration of obedience that barely concealed her desire for freedom and authenticity. Helen, a silent witness to this conversation, felt a mix of indignation and helplessness. In her heart, a flame of rebellion burned, a fervent desire to protect Susan from the incessant cycle of criticism and unreasonable expectations. How does he not see? How does he not see what he's doing to her? Helen thought, her mind racing with concern and care. Susan is so bright, so full of life, and he only sees flaws where he should see virtues. But what can I do? How can I help her see her own light? The meal ended in a disheartened atmosphere, each family member lost in their own thoughts and worries. Charles was the first to rise, immersed in his plans and schedules, leaving behind a trail of unspoken expectations as he headed toward the living room. After Charles left, Helen approached Susan, who still seemed lost in her thoughts. With gentleness, the maid sat down beside the young girl, preparing to address a topic she knew was sensitive. "Susan, when you mentioned your mother today, I saw something in your eyes. Something that tells me this is more than just missing her. Your mother, Dorothy. She must be very special to you, isn't she?" Helen said, initiating a conversation she knew was necessary, a gesture of concern and affection. Susan looked at Helen, a mix of surprise and relief in her eyes for having someone to share her feelings with. "Yes, Helen, she is. I think about her every day, but my father doesn't like to talk about her, as you saw. After they separated, he said it was better for me to stay with him, that he had the resources and knowledge to give me a better future," Susan confessed, the words flowing more easily than she expected, fueled by the safety Helen provided. Helen nodded, absorbing every word with empathy. "I understand, dear. It's a complicated situation. But tell me, how did your mother Dorothy feel about this? About you staying with your father?" Helen's question was not just out of curiosity. She sought to understand the situation completely, perhaps to find a way to help the young girl deal with her feelings and maybe even find a solution to the rift that seemed to separate mother and daughter. Susan sighed, a visible weight on her shoulders as she recalled those moments. "My mother, she was heartbroken, Helen, but at the time she didn't have much choice. My father was right in a way. He had more money and my mother was just starting to get back on her feet after the separation. She told me it was temporary, that we would be together again soon. But that never happened since I was 6 years old." Susan's words were laden with deep sadness, revealing the pain of an unfulfilled promise, a hope that had faded over time. Helen gently took Susan's hand, offering silent comfort. "Susan, your mother loves you, of that I have no doubt, and maybe there's still a way for you two to reclaim that lost time. Life is full of surprises and love finds a way. Maybe it's time we start thinking about how we can make that reunion happen." Helen's words were more than comfort. They were a pledge of support, a promise that she would stand by Susan, helping her find the path back to Dorothy's arms. The conversation between Helen and Susan continued, each word weaving a thread of hope into the young girl's heart. At that moment, more than ever, Susan felt she was not alone on her journey, and with Helen by her side, perhaps, just perhaps, she could find her way back to the mother she loved so much. After an intense and emotional conversation, it was time for Susan to prepare to accompany Charles in the planned activities for the rest of the day. Helen watched as Susan gathered her things, the girl's expression a mix of resignation and determination. "Helen, thank you for everything. I don't even know how I'm going to—" "Well, just thank you," Susan said, stumbling over her words, the weight of her gratitude so great it seemed difficult to express it fully. Helen smiled, nodding. You never need to thank me, dear. Remember, I'm here for whatever you need. And let's think about what we talked about, okay? Everything will work out, you'll see, Helen replied, trying to infuse each word with optimism, though her heart ached to see Susan leave. Charles called from outside, his voice interrupting their brief moment together. "Susan, we're late, let's go!" With a final shared look, Susan turned, heading toward her father's voice, leaving Helen alone in the room, wrapped in her thoughts. As soon as the door closed behind Susan and Charles, Helen turned her attention to the house. There was much to do, and although her hands were busy, her mind was elsewhere. As she cleaned and organized, Helen began to form light plans, subtle ways to improve Susan's life within the limitations they faced. Maybe I can find a way for Susan to spend more time in the garden. She always seems happier out there, away from the pressures, Helen mused aloud, wiping the dining room table. But then, doubt crept in, like a shadow over her optimism. But what about Charles? He would certainly find a way to see it as a distraction. No, that wouldn't be enough. The next idea came while she was folding Susan's clothes, a routine gesture that now carried new weight. What if I tried talking to Charles, explaining how much Susan needs a little more freedom, maybe even suggesting that she could visit Dorothy? The idea seemed promising for a moment, but soon Helen shook her head, frustrated. Who am I to him? Just a maid. He would never listen to me, especially not about how to raise his own daughter. Helen continued her chores, but each task was accompanied by a potential plan, and inevitably the doubts that followed. What if I started small? Subtle changes, maybe convincing Charles to let Susan choose her own clothes for the fashion shows, something that would make her feel like she has some control over her life. But again, reality imposed itself. He would probably say I don't understand anything about the world of fashion competitions, and he wouldn't be entirely wrong. At one point, Helen was in Mr. Moore's office and came across some documents. However, what stood out most to her was one that had some important information. She picked up the document, read it, and discovered it contained Dorothy's address, Susan's mother. I'll take paper and pen and write this down. I might need it someday. Thinking far ahead, Helen wrote down Dorothy's supposed address on a piece of paper and tucked it into her pants. At the end of the day, Helen sat in the kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands, contemplating the quiet of the now empty house. Each plan she had formed seemed so fragile in the face of the situation's reality, so full of potential failures and obstacles that made her question if there was anything at all, she could actually do to help. Am I just deluding myself? Helen wondered, the sense of helplessness growing. Maybe there's no way to change things. Maybe I'm just placing hopes where there are no solutions. And yet, despite the doubts and uncertainty, Helen knew she couldn't give up. For Susan, she would try. Even if each plan seemed doomed to fail, the alternative was something Helen simply couldn't accept. After the serene farewell, Helen felt the heavy atmosphere settling over the mansion. In her mind echoed the crying she had thought was a dream the night before. What if it wasn't a dream? What if Susan really needs me and I'm just convincing myself it's my imagination? Helen pondered, feeling a responsibility that surpassed her routine duties. She decided then not to succumb to sleep so easily that night. As the house fell silent and the hours passed, Helen stayed awake, alert to any signs from upstairs. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. Susan is fine, she's just tired. Yes, that must be it. She tried to convince herself, seeking to justify her growing concern. But the calm was deceptive, and soon it was interrupted by muffled sounds of a heated argument. The arguments were hard to distinguish, but the tension in the voices was undeniable. This isn't right. What's going on up there? Helen questioned herself, her heart tightening with anxiety. She knew confrontations between Charles and Susan weren't uncommon, but something about the intensity of this argument alarmed her more than usual. Rising, Helen headed to the stairs, moving with a lightness that only years of silent navigation through the mansion could provide. I'll just check, just to make sure Susan is okay, she justified her act of spying, the concern for Susan justifying her boldness in defying the unspoken rules of the house about privacy and hierarchy. As she approached Susan's room, the sound of crying became clearer, more desperate, cutting through Helen's heart. Oh, Susan, what can I do to help? How can I protect you if I can't even fully understand what you're facing? Helen wrestled internally, torn between the urgency to intervene and the awareness of her limitations as a maid. Standing in front of Susan's bedroom door, Helen hesitated. If I go in now, what will Charles say? And Susan, How would she feel knowing I heard? But how can I just ignore this crying, these raised voices in anguish? Helen grappled with her sense of duty and her protective instinct, an internal battle that reflected the turmoil on the other side of the door. Outside Susan's room, Helen felt each word like a blade, her heart tightening with each phrase she could discern through the door. The argument that initially seemed muffled and indistinct began to reveal itself in all its harshness and severity. "I can't take this anymore, Dad. I've had enough. I don't want to be a model. I don't like it. Never did and never will." Susan's voice was laden with despair and frustration, breaking the barrier Charles tried to impose with his authority. "You don't understand, Susan. This is for your own good. The rehearsals, the shows, the diets, all of this is necessary. You need this to be someone, to have a future." Charles's voice, powerful and definitive, cut through the air, his words sounding more like orders than fatherly advice. "But I'm unhappy, Dad. This is killing me inside. It's not the life I want, but you've been pushing this on me for a long time, and I'm tired," Susan cried, her voice choked with tears, a living testament to the pain she felt, not just physically but emotionally and psychologically. Charles, however, seemed unwilling to yield or even listen. "If you don't follow what I'm saying, I'll have to take more drastic measures. I'll further reduce your food intake, cut off any contact with the outside world. You need to learn discipline, Susan, even if I have to force you to do it." Charles's words were cold, calculated, revealing a disturbing detachment from his own daughter's well-being. "You can't do this to me. This is abuse, Dad. I wish Mom were here. She would never have allowed this." Susan's final cry was a mix of defiance and plea, a desperate appeal for a different life, for a reality where her voice was heard and her pain acknowledged. Helen, outside, could hardly believe what she was hearing. Charles's words, Susan's pleas, all painted a picture of abuse and suffering she could no longer ignore. "This can't go on. I have to do something," she thought, the decision growing in her heart like a flame. Driven by a sense of urgency that surpassed any fear or hesitation, Helen ran down the stairs, her steps echoing through the quiet house. She knew what she was about to do could change everything, but the awareness of Susan's suffering gave her the courage she needed. Reaching the house's landline phone, Helen dialed the numbers with trembling yet determined hands. "Police, please! It's an emergency," she said as soon as the call was answered, her voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions consuming her. Helen knew that by making this call she was crossing a threshold from which there was no return, but the conviction that she was doing the right thing to protect Susan gave her the strength to go on. As she held the phone, Helen took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "I need help. There's a situation here where I believe a child is in danger. Please send a patrol car quickly," she stated, her voice a mix of urgency and concern. "What exactly is going on, ma'am? We need more information before we can send one of our units. If you could provide details, we would be extremely grateful for your cooperation." The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but clearly interested in the details Helen could provide. "It's the daughter of the house owner. He's being very strict with her, forcing her into a career she doesn't want, controlling what she eats, how she lives. I heard a very intense argument just now, threats. I just think someone needs to come here and check," Helen explained, each word laden with a weight she felt deeply. "Understood, ma'am. We'll send a team right away. Stay safe and try not to intervene until we arrive, okay? I need you to stay at this location if possible." The voice offered not just instructions but also a certain comfort, a promise that help was on the way. Helen hung up the phone, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. She knew she had done the right thing, but the wait for the next 30 minutes would be torturous. Every second seemed to stretch infinitely as she pondered the possible consequences of her action. When the police finally arrived, Helen greeted them at the entrance. "Please come in. It's about Mr. Moore and his daughter Susan. I've been feeling for a while that I needed to talk to someone about what's happening, and you will be that someone," she said, guiding them inside with a silent urgency. One of the officers, a man with a firm posture and understanding eyes, asked to speak with Charles. "Mr. Moore, we need to talk about some concerns raised by your maid regarding your treatment of your daughter," he said, in a voice that left no room for refusal. As Charles went to meet the officers, his expression was a mix of surprise and irritation. He had no idea what awaited him, though deep down he might have suspected. Helen watched from a distance, hoping that Susan would finally receive the help she so desperately needed. In her room, isolated from the commotion unfolding downstairs, Susan allowed herself to dive into happier memories, times that seemed to belong to another world. She remembered a specific day with her mother, Dorothy, before the separation, a day that remained bright in her memory like a beacon of love and freedom. After the tense interaction with Charles Moore, the officers requested Helen's presence for a brief statement. With a heavy heart, she walked over to them, hoping her words could make a difference, that her concern for Susan would be enough to trigger a change. "Officers, I just want the best for Susan. She is a sweet, intelligent girl who is being forced to live a life she didn't choose," Helen explained, the words flowing from a place of love and desperation. One of the officers, with a sympathetic look, nodded, understanding the delicate situation. "We understand your concern and we will document everything you said. But without concrete evidence or the child's statement confirming these allegations, our ability to intervene is limited," he said, his voice carrying a professional lament for the impotence of the law in certain situations. Although Helen had expected this outcome on some level, she felt a wave of desolation hearing the officer's words. "So, there's nothing you can do at this moment, is that what you're telling me?" she asked, holding on tightly to the last spark of hope. "For now, no. But we are here if the situation changes, if another witness comes forward, if there is some really concrete evidence. We are taking Charles to the station for a statement, but he will be released soon if there's no trial," the other officer added, leaving the sentence unfinished, a tacit invitation to keep the lines of communication open. Returning inside, Helen found Susan, who was anxiously awaiting news. With a sigh that carried the weight of the world, Helen spoke. "Susan, they said they can't do anything. My statement, being just the maid, isn't enough, and without proof there's not much we can do." Her voice faltered, the words as difficult to say as they were to accept. Susan, whose eyes were already filled with tears, simply broke down, the reality of the situation enveloping her like a cold, dense fog. "So we are alone in this," she murmured, more to herself than to Helen. Together they spent the rest of the night in somber silence, the shared sadness forming an even stronger bond between them, despite the despair. The night hadn't yet ended when Charles Moore returned from the police station. His expression was one of contained fury, and without a word he turned to Helen. "You are fired. Pack your things and leave my house," he said, his voice as cutting as the cold wind beginning to blow outside. Helen, though shocked by the sudden decision, knew that her attempt to help Susan had sealed her fate in that house. With tears in her eyes but her dignity intact, she gathered her belongings, each piece a reminder of the years dedicated to that family, now ended by an act of courage. As Charles ruthlessly threw her bags outside into the falling rain, Helen felt the night's chill mix with the cold in her heart. "I'm sorry, Susan. I promise I'll do what I can from out here for you," she said, a final whispered farewell to the girl who had become so dear to her. Walking away from the Moore mansion under the rain that washed the streets but not the weight of her sadness, Helen wondered about the future, about what would become of Susan. And as the distance between her and the mansion grew, Helen carried with her the hope that somehow Susan would find her way to happiness, away from the shadows of an imposed destiny. After a turbulent night, Helen found refuge in her small apartment, located a short distance from the Moore mansion. The space, though modest, offered a quiet comfort, a welcome contrast to the tension that had marked her last hours under the same roof as Charles and Susan. As she lay down, the exhaustion of the day enveloped her, but her mind refused to rest. Instead, she planned, pondered what she could do next, how she could somehow make a difference in Susan's life. The idea of contacting Dorothy, Susan's mother, emerged like a flash of hope in the darkness. Maybe Dorothy can do something. Maybe she doesn't know how much Susan is suffering, Helen thought, turning in bed, her determination growing with the first rays of light seeping through the curtains. At dawn, Helen rose with renewed purpose. Rummaging through her things for Dorothy's address, she finally found the crumpled piece of paper in the pocket of dirty pants, a reminder of quieter days when the prospect of contacting Dorothy seemed unnecessary, a precaution for a scenario Helen hoped never to face. Armed with the address and a heart heavy with worry but light with hope, Helen hailed a taxi. The journey to the neighboring city where Dorothy lived was marked by an acute anxiety, each mile traveled bringing her closer to a confrontation she hoped could change the course of Susan's future. Dorothy's house, when it finally came into view, was exactly as Helen had imagined from Susan's descriptions. Large, yes, but of an older and modest model, simple. There was a tranquil beauty in the structure, a charm that spoke of stories and lives lived within its walls. Stepping out of the taxi, Helen approached the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. Is this right? Am I doing the right thing? She wondered, doubting her decision for a moment. But then she remembered Susan, her crying, her pain, and any hesitation dissipated. For Susan, she whispered to herself, a mantra that gave her strength. Standing before Dorothy's door, Helen took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage. She knew the next few hours could very well define Susan's future, and the gravity of that thought weighed on her like never before. With a trembling hand, Helen raised her arm and knocked on the door, each knock echoing not only through the old wood but through her own heart. After a few moments of palpable anticipation, the door opened, revealing Dorothy. The expression of surprise on her face gave way to cautious curiosity upon seeing Helen, an almost stranger at her door. "Can I help you?" Dorothy asked, her voice soft, echoing the sweetness of her disposition despite the uncertainty shadowing her eyes. "My name is Helen. I used to work for Charles, Susan's father. I need to talk to you about your daughter. It's very important. It can't wait another second. I believe she may be in danger," Helen began, her voice firm but laden with an urgency that left no doubt about the seriousness of her visit. Dorothy stepped back, making room for Helen to enter. "Please, come in. What happened to Susan?" The concern immediately tinged her words as she led Helen to the living room. The simplicity and warmth of the home's interior formed a stark contrast to the coldness of the Moore mansion, reflecting the fundamental difference between Dorothy and Charles. Sitting across from Dorothy, Helen took a deep breath before starting. "Susan is suffering, Dorothy. Charles is forcing her into a modeling career, something she clearly hates. She is being controlled in every aspect of her life, from what she eats to whom she can talk to. I heard an argument last night. He threatened to cut her food intake even more, among other things." "Susan is desperate," Helen reported, each word reinforced by conviction and concern. Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes as she listened. "I knew Charles was strict, but this is too much. I always feared Susan would end up trapped in that world Charles idealized for her. But I never imagined it was this severe," Dorothy said, the pain of not having been there for her daughter evident in every syllable. Helen held Dorothy's hand, seeking to offer some comfort. "I know it's hard, but I believe that together we can do right by Susan. Your voice, as her mother, has power. If you're willing to speak up to give your testimony about Charles, we can protect Susan," Helen affirmed, her gaze meeting Dorothy's with unshakable determination. Dorothy, though still clearly shaken by the situation, nodded, a resolution firming in her eyes. "You're right, Helen. I would do anything to protect my daughter, to get her out of this situation. I'll give my testimony about what I've experienced at the hands of that man. I'll do whatever it takes," Dorothy said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, the natural sweetness of her personality now tempered with the courage of a mother determined to fight for her daughter. Without wasting time, Dorothy picked up the phone, dialing the number of the police station in Charles's city. "Hello, my name is Dorothy. I am the mother of Susan Moore. I would like to schedule a time to give a statement about my daughter's father, Charles Moore. It is an urgent matter," she explained when the call was answered, each word pronounced with a clarity that left little room for doubt about her intent. After the decisive conversations at Dorothy's house, they headed to the police station in Charles's city, filled with a mix of anxiety and determination. Meanwhile, in a moment of growing desperation, Charles Moore faced the possibility of losing control over the situation and, most importantly, over Susan. Alone in his office, Charles thought about the recent turn of events. If Dorothy finds out about this and decides to fight for Susan's custody, if the police start to believe these absurd accusations, I can't let that happen. Susan is my responsibility, my daughter. I know what's best for her, he thought, convincing himself that his actions, no matter how extreme, were justified. The idea of fleeing began to take shape in his mind, a drastic solution to a growing problem. If we simply disappear for a while until this calms down, yes, that could work, Charles concluded, the twisted logic of his plans reflecting the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. Without wasting time, Charles found Susan, telling her they needed to take a sudden trip. "It's for your own good, Susan. Trust me and don't ask questions. "I'm your father, and I just want to see you well," he insisted, guiding his reluctant and confused daughter to the car. At the police station, Dorothy was preparing to give her testimony, each word carefully considered but firm. "Charles has always been controlling, but I never imagined it would come to this with our daughter. Susan doesn't deserve to live like this, under constant pressure and unhappiness. She deserves to be free to choose her own path," Dorothy explained to the officers, her voice carrying a mix of pain and determination. The officers listened attentively, noting every detail. "Your testimony could make all the difference, Dorothy. We'll do everything in our power to ensure Susan's safety," one of them assured her, recognizing the courage Dorothy showed in confronting the situation. Soon a patrol was sent to Charles's house, but they didn't find him there. Suspecting he might be fleeing, they took to the city streets, and the patrol car spotted a vehicle matching the description of Charles's car. Cautiously, the officers began to follow, maintaining a safe distance but keeping a close eye on any suspicious movements. Inside the car, Susan felt a mix of fear and confusion. "Where are we going, Dad? What's happening? I just want an explanation for why we're leaving the city so suddenly," she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Everything is under control, Susan. We just need some time away from all this until things calm down," Charles responded, trying to maintain his composure, though his mind was in turmoil, thinking about the consequences of his actions and how they might anger Susan's mother. The careful police pursuit continued. At one point, the patrol car turned on its siren and forced Charles to a stop, with the officers approaching his vehicle cautiously. "Mr. Moore, please step out of the car with your hands where we can see them," an officer instructed, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension of the moment. As Charles was led out of the car by the police, his face reflected a mix of emotions, primarily a silent desperation at losing control of the situation. "This can't be happening. Everything I did was for Susan's future," he thought, his internal justifications clashing with the reality of his actions finally being confronted. Susan, separated from her father and taken in a different police car, was immersed in her own tumultuous thoughts. "What's going to happen now? Does this mean things will change? I just wish Mom were here," she reflected. Upon arriving at the police station and seeing Dorothy and Helen, Susan could hardly contain the flood of emotions overwhelming her. She ran toward them, her words tumbling out as she tried to express everything she felt. "Mom, Helen, I was so scared. I didn't know if you would know what happened to me. I didn't know if I would see you again," Susan said, relief and gratitude overflowing in every word. Dorothy, with tears in her eyes, responded with a voice choked with emotion. "Susan, my dear, I'm so sorry for everything you had to go through, but you're safe now. We will take care of you. We will make sure everything is resolved," she promised, reaffirming her commitment not just as a mother but as a protector. An officer approached them, ready to explain the situation. "Ladies, I want you to know that Charles Moore has been arrested on several serious charges, including emotional abuse and neglect. Your testimony, along with the evidence we've gathered, was crucial in ensuring we could take this action," he explained, detailing the legal procedures that would follow and emphasizing the seriousness of the charges against Charles. Helen, hearing the officer's words, felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. "Susan, this means you won't have to go back to that house, to that life. We will find a way to rebuild, to make you feel safe and loved again," she said, her determination to support Susan as unwavering as ever. Susan, hugged by her mother and Helen, finally allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. "Maybe now I can have the chance to just be me," she thought, the idea of a fresh start, free from the shadows of the past beginning to form in her mind. As the officer stepped away, Dorothy turned her attention to Helen, a grateful sparkle and an idea forming in her eyes. "Helen, you are now without a job for doing what was right for Susan. I was thinking, I would love to experience someone else's cooking for a while. Would you consider coming to work with me at my house? I know Susan would love to have you around," Dorothy said with a smile. Helen, surprised and touched by the offer, couldn't help but smile broadly. "I would be honored, Dorothy. Nothing would make me happier than to continue being a part of Susan's life, and now yours too," she replied, the joy and relief at having a path forward radiating from her. Susan, hearing the exchange between the two, felt her heart warm with the prospect of having Helen close, of starting her new life with so much love and support. "This is going to be amazing. "Helen makes the best cakes," she exclaimed, her voice reflecting the happiness she felt as everything was falling into place so well. 2 months had passed since that day at the police station, and life at Dorothy's house had transformed into a haven of peace and new beginnings. On a typical day, the house was filled with laughter and conversations, a stark contrast to the dark days of Susan's past. "Mom, Helen, I got a high grade on my essay about what is happiness." Susan shared during breakfast, her enthusiasm evident. "I wrote about finding happiness in the little things like having my mom and Helen around." Dorothy smiled, exchanging a knowing look with Helen. "That's wonderful, Susan. We are so proud of you. Seeing you happy is our greatest happiness." "I love you so much, my daughter," Dorothy said, grateful for the harmony that now filled her home. Meanwhile, far away in jail, Charles Moore spent his days brooding over the situation, his anger and resentment growing inside him. "They will see. They don't know what they did," he thought, unable to find remorse for his actions, even as he faced many years behind bars. Back at Dorothy's house, life continued with a new rhythm, a rhythm of healing, love, and rebuilding. "You know, I never imagined we could be so well after everything," Helen reflected as she helped Susan with her homework. "And I never imagined I would have the chance to be simply happy again. But here we are, me, my mom, and you, my best friend," Susan replied, a genuine smile on her face, the gratitude for her new life and the constant presence of Dorothy and Helen illuminating her days. And so, amidst laughter, learning, and shared moments, the story of Susan, Dorothy, and Helen continued, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the human capacity to start anew, with justice that, although it had taken some time, brought peace to their lives. You've reached the end of another story. We invite you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support motivates us to keep posting exciting narratives almost daily. Don't forget to watch the video that is about to appear on your screen. See you there.